Hey, it's Conrad Thompson. Thanks for checking out the podcast here on YouTube. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notifications bell. You'll get a notice anytime we upload some new content. And when I'm not asking Bruce, hey, how big was Batista's? Well, you know. One of the things I like to do is help people save money. And if you're watching this video right now and you're in a 30-year loan, man, you're overpaying your single biggest bill and you may not even realize it. I want you to do a little experiment for me. Take your calculator out, multiply your monthly house payment by 360 payments. That's how many payments there are in a 30-year loan. That big scary number, that's your total of payments. You're looking at that number? You know you can do better. Keep more of your own money right now and go to savewithconrad.com. Or maybe you've got credit card debt. Man, it's not a matter of if I can save you money with that. Your average interest rate on a credit card is more than 20%. And by the way, all the interest you pay on those credit cards, it's not tax deductible. Whereas the mortgage interest, well, that is tax deductible. So if you owe this debt, it's up to you how to pay it back. Doesn't it make sense to get the cheapest rate possible and the greatest tax deduction possible? Find out how much money you can save right now for free at savewithconrad.com. You don't need perfect credit. Even scores in the 500s can be approved, and it's no cost out of pocket. But maybe best of all, we're licensed in more than 40 states. We can help more families than ever before. But how much can we save you? Find out right now for free with a quick quote from savewithconrad.com. Hey, it's Conrad Thompson, and you're listening to Something to Wrestle with Bruce Prichard. Bruce, what's going on, man? How are you?
I'm just a box of fluffy ducks, by God. I tell you, though, you know what? We're going to start off on a kind of sad note, or at least a salute out to Don Kernoodle. Rest in peace, Don. Don was one of those guys that I don't know that he ever met someone that, you know, was a stranger and always had fond memories. And Don, I was very sad to hear of his passing this week.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, man. I feel like, you know, they say deaths come in threes, and I hope that's not the case because we just lost New Jack too. Did you ever meet New Jack? I know you guys never worked together.
Never met the man.
Wow.
Never met the man. It's kind of like New Jack's up there with Ole Anderson. I've never met Ole.
Really?
Yeah.
That's crazy to me to think about all the years, especially with Ole way back when. That's crazy.
Yeah. Going through, just all the different incarnations and what have you. And, have never met the man.
Well, I'm glad that Ole's still with us. Rest in peace and thoughts and prayers, which is, I guess, a cliche at this point, but man, I've fallen in love with all things Jim Crockett again. So I've seen way more Don Kernoodle. And of course, you know, I'm an ECW sycophant, I think is what you called me once. So
a sycophant.
Yeah. And I was like, I have to Google that, but
I'm a sicko fan.
Yeah. Maybe that's what you meant. Yeah. Maybe that's what you meant.
Hey, it could be, you know, just, you never really know anymore.
Well, listen, we missed this past Friday's drop. Our plan was to drop on Tuesday, but that didn't happen. And of course, a lot of you claimed that Something to Wrestle was dead, but here we are in zombie form. You just can't kill us, Bruce. You just can't.
Absolutely. We can just keep coming back.
You know, in about 10 years, I'm going to bust your balls, right?
In 10 years, I'll fucking be able to explain to you the beauty of all things beautiful.
Okay. With that note, let's talk about Dr. Death, Steve Williams. We originally hoped
maybe 12 years. I'm trying to think. Anyway, go ahead.
I hope it's not that long. Well,
it's almost been 5, motherfucker.
No, it hasn't. You started in 19.
What?
It's been 2 years and 3 months.
No, I know, but God, would you jump into the now?
Okay, I got you.
Okay, you in here with me?
I'm with you.
You're up in the now.
I'm in the now. I'm buckled in.
All right. It's been 5 years since we've been doing this shiznit.
Oh yeah, you're exactly right. It has been.
Cast a pod.
Can you believe that?
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. I remember saying, yeah, okay, we'll do it for a couple months and we'll get tired of it.
Ta-da. It worked out, buddy.
Moved on and all that shit.
Well, we're moving on to talk about Dr. Death today. Of course, this past Friday would have been his birthday. He was born on May 14th, 1960. So that would have been his 61st birthday. Still a young man. Born in Lakewood, Colorado. He graduated Lakewood High School in 78. And of course, famously went to Oklahoma University. Here's a fun fact for you. Steve actually earned the name Dr. Death before he even graduated high school because he shattered his nose when he was wrestling and he had to wrestle in an old school hockey goalie mask. So the nickname Dr. Death is legitimately from amateur wrestling. How about that?
Well, as a child, you learn that, you learn your doctor skills, and then you learn your deathful skills, and he got both of them all at the same time, hence being Dr. Death. Yeah, no, man, Doc was a stud from day one. And coming out, I think he was wrestling and whooping people's ass. Probably slapped the doctor back after he got whacked in the ass that very first day on Earth.
Of course, he's not just a wrestler. He was also a hell of an offensive lineman. He was one of the most recruited kids in the country before he winds up at Oklahoma. His brother was already there as a starting tight end, but at Oklahoma, he's going to both wrestle and play football. He becomes a 4-time All-American wrestler. He finished 6th as a freshman, 5th as a sophomore, 3rd as a junior, and 2nd as a senior after a defeat to future Olympic medalist Bruce Baumgartner. So no shame in losing to a Bruce around these parts, right?
Absolutely not. But, Doc was one of those guys, and he had a reputation. And look, I mean, reality in the wrestling business, you really didn't pay that much attention to the amateur wrestlers coming up unless there was somebody really making some noise. And I didn't hear of Doc until he actually came into the business, and then you kind of go back and learn all these things about him. But when you go back and learn and you talk to people who actually encountered Doc on the mat or on the football field, they always remembered because he was that much of a fucking stud athlete.
So let's talk about, and this is always fun to talk about sort of the beginnings of big star wrestlers. Before he comes in, he's in the 80 Orange Bowl. He's in the 81 Sun Bowl. He's drafted by the New Jersey Generals in the USFL draft in 83. But before he gets drafted to play pro ball, he's already training to be a professional wrestler with Cowboy Bill Watts and Buddy Landell, and he debuts in 82. So I know it's a different time, but back then, especially in the Watts territory, and we've all heard this through JR's commentary for decades now, you really gravitated towards quote unquote real athletes, right? Vern Gagne, Bill Watts, they wanted to know, where'd you play sports? Where'd you go to college, et cetera, right?
Sure, because you wanted the real deal, and you wanted someone who could protect the business inside and out. And when you have a legitimate pedigree and a legitimate background to point to, then it's hard for people to come back and say, oh yeah, he's in that fake wrestling bullshit. It's like, okay, hey man, you want to see fake? Let me show you fake. And you have that real pedigree, and you have that athleticism to put someone in their place if need be. And it was all entertainment then. It's all entertainment now. And it was just a different way of going about the business. And it was like, hey, look at who we've got from a fan perspective. And when I say a fan perspective, I'll use my perspective, even growing up as a kid, with the exception of Dory Funk Jr. and West Texas State University, because that's where the Funks went. So who wouldn't want to go there? And for someone who said something on Twitter or something, it's not ven por ellas, ven por ella, ven por ella, come and get it. But you didn't, I think that there was a feeling sometimes, hey, this guy came from the NFL. And when you would actually have conversations with people around you at the wrestling matches as a kid growing up, I remember people feeling that if someone came from the NFL, that sometimes there was a feeling, with few exceptions, Wahoo McDaniel, Ernie Ladd, Dr. Death is a really good exception. But the feeling was they couldn't make it in football, so they came to wrestling.
Right.
And that was just real talk. I always remember as a kid being in the audience with just, fans around us. Oh, he couldn't make it in the NFL, so he came here. Not knowing, Wahoo McDaniel came into wrestling for the money. The money was better than the NFL. Ernie Ladd, the same thing. So it depends. It differs at times, and there's been some truly great football players that have come through and excelled. Maybe it was an injury. Maybe it was something else. But the perception was, hey, this guy's this. When you're telling me how great he was at football, You're telling me, well, maybe he's not so great at wrestling.
Right.
So it's a double-edged sword, and I always kind of poo-pooed the accolades a lot of times of people coming in with those kind of credentials.
It's been said that Bill Watts really wanted Steve to be like his personal protege. Do you think there's any similarities between the two?
Sure. I think that, Doc going to the University of Oklahoma and Watts also coming up, playing football in college, and Watts was a stud. Watts was a hell of an athlete back in the day and got into professional wrestling through Leroy McGurk and those guys, good Lord, Luthez and what have you. But Watts, I think, saw a little bit of himself in Dr. Death and just wanted to exploit that as best he could.
Did you see any of his matches on TV before you met him in person?
Unfortunately, yeah.
So you were watching Watts TV even while you worked for Paul Bosch?
Yeah.
What was the relationship like with Houston wrestling and Mid-South wrestling, or Paul and Bill? What was it like here in early 80s?
In the very early 80s at this time, it really wasn't that much. And I'll tell you how I got to see it and why I got to see it, because we ran Beaumont, Texas, which was right on the Louisiana border. Beaumont would get television from Lake Charles, Louisiana. In Lake Charles, Louisiana, they had the Mid-South show. So you would get people in Beaumont asking us, hey, when y'all gonna bring Junkyard Dog in? When y'all gonna bring Ted DiBiase in? And they didn't understand this was two different booking offices and so on and so forth. They saw the Houston Wrestling Show, which was available on cable, but locally, they also saw Lake Charles TV as well. So I would get, even back then, I would get tapes and I would take a look at, what was going on with that television show in Louisiana. And you saw Dr. Death, you saw JYD and people like that.
Let's talk about the first time you met Dr. Death. When do you see him? Do you remember the first time you met him, like in person?
It was in Houston, and it had to be 83, maybe.
Okay.
When Watts came in and Watts became a partner in Houston. It was in that time frame. We had broken away from the Southwest Championship Wrestling booking office in San Antonio, and Watts came in, and I think that it was right around that time. But Doc was just this big, husky, not real muscular, big.
Right.
But not cut up like he eventually got. We started dieting. He was thick as a fucking house. But just kind of a big, rugged, I don't want to say dumb, but I think that people, if you talk to him for a little while, or didn't get to talk to him for a little while, you would get the impression that he was just a big dumb jock. Now, if you had a conversation with him, you'd get to know Steve Williams, and he was a really good dude and a pretty smart dude too.
The first note I can find where Steve wrestled in Houston, and this might not be the first one, but it's the first one I can find, is January 14th, 1983. He's wrestling in Houston, Texas for Houston Wrestling. Of course, Watts is still probably involved at that point, but Steve gets a win over a young Marty Lundy.
Oh, Marty Lundy. Yeah, by God, old Marty Lundy, that Ern Anderson feller. And Marty had that long blonde hair and shit, and it was thinning, very thin blonde hair. Listen, probably gave Doc a hell of a scrap, but I doubt that old Marty Lundy came out on the winning end of that one that night.
July 8th, they would be back in Houston. And again, he's working with Marty Lundy. So whoever's booking these cards knows, hey, old Arn will make sure that Dr. Death looks like $1 million. What are your first impressions of him? When you said you saw his matches on TV and you said the phrase, unfortunately, talk to me about that. What are
early on, Doc wasn't good.
All right.
Doc was not good. Doc was one of those naturals like The Rock or even a Brock Lesnar that got in the ring and Kurt Angle that was able to get in the ring and adapt their amateur style to the professional style. Doc was clumsy. He was big, didn't realize his own strength a lot of times, and just didn't have a whole lot of charisma early on.
Well, there is a classic match from the UWF on YouTube. If you want to go check it out, it's the Sam Houston Coliseum. It's Terry Gordy and Dr. Death, future tag team partners. It happened the day after Christmas, December 26, 1986. I think you should go out of your way to check it out. It's an amazing match between two incredible performers and a super hot crowd. Do you happen to remember that quote unquote day after Christmas show from the Houston Coliseum?
Absolutely. And, you look at this in 1986, where Doc had now been in the business several years. Doc had changed his body, put him with Ted DiBiase as his tag team partner. Ted helped Doc tremendously. I think that was the best thing to happen to Steve Williams, was to be able to team with DiBiase and have Ted work with him every single night, tell him what to do, what not to do. He gave Doc the hot tag, but Teddy would talk him all the way through it. And Dr. Death became really, really good in a short period of time because he had the aptitude and he also had the attitude and desire to want to be better. I think that Doc would take a lot of it to heart sometimes when people felt that he was getting the push because, Oklahoma, University of Oklahoma, goddamn Oklahoma, well, fucks from Oklahoma. And here is the problem with that is when you ran markets, as we did, Houston was an entity unto itself. San Antonio was an entity unto itself a lot of ways. Dallas was Dallas. But if you had someone, for example, that came from, good Lord, especially Oklahoma, there was a natural rivalry between the state of Oklahoma and the state of Texas. The only thing that keeps Texas from slipping into the Gulf of Mexico is Oklahoma sucks. You're welcome, Jerry Briscoe. So there was just a natural, it was the Red River rivalry, man. That's why the Texas OU game every day, every week, every year, every day, every week, every year, that was such a big rivalry from the two states. So when you take someone that is a big star at the University of Oklahoma and you put them in Texas and you make a big deal out of all of their accolades at the University of Oklahoma, fuck him. Right. I don't like him.
Right.
The audience doesn't care what Bill Watts likes or JR likes. Because now you're in a different area.
Yeah.
That we've got UT, we've got Texas A&M, we've got the University of Houston. Those are our home teams. And OU, you're across that Red River. We don't care. Same thing for University of Oklahoma. Or for Oklahoma. You don't want to bring in Dick Murdoch and say and talk about West Texas State or talk about the University of Texas. They're going to be heels when you bill them that way. And I know I've told you the story about just people that have a strong allegiance to a college. Man, it can fuck up business deals. It can I don't know why that never brought in, but it was Bill's TV, and Doc was going to be a babyface because he's from the University of Oklahoma. So by God bless OU. Fuck OU.
What ultimately led to the falling out with Bosch and Watts? I don't think we've talked about it explicitly before.
No, I'm sure we have. 100% the falling out was when Watts sold the territory to Crockett and didn't tell Paul Bosch.
Oh yeah. But were there any cracks before that? Like where guys were unhappy, where you could tell like, we'll do it, but we really don't want to.
I think that from Paul's perspective, that Paul thought Bill owned everything. From Bill's perspective, Bill felt Paul and his nephew didn't do enough to contribute. So both sides had, and frankly, both sides were right in a lot of respects.
Right.
But it was just a difference of opinion, and I think Bill wanted to own all of Houston, and Paul wanted someone else to own more of it, type thing. I don't think Paul wanted to be in control. Overall, he wanted to be the face of it. He wanted to be the promoter and the TV guy, but Paul wasn't looking to be in charge and be running a town anymore, or be running a territory anymore.
Well, as you mentioned, Crockett purchases the UWF in late 87, and Dr. Death makes the move to Jim Crockett Promotions. Now, by 87, you're already with the World Wrestling Federation. Did you think Steve would be a fit with Jim Crockett? Or did you think that their style was just a little too different from Watts for him to be successful there?
I thought that Doc was one of those guys that could probably... Same thing. I think that sometimes Doc was painted too much with that Oklahoma brush.
Yeah.
That it's one thing to be that tough Texan, by God. Oklahoma was polarizing. Texas is fucking polarizing. It's hard to then take that and go into the Carolinas, go into Tennessee, and go into Florida, and God forbid. Doc needed to make his own identity as Dr. Death Steve Williams wrestler, not Dr. Death Steve Williams. We love you, OU. Do you know what? This is the other thing that just tickles me sometimes. Do you know what a Sooner is?
I don't.
Okay. Oklahoma, they're called the Sooners.
Yeah. Is that a dog?
No, okay. It is not. It is not. Back in the early, 1800s or whatever it was, when they had the land rush.
Yes.
And the land grab.
Got it.
So they had all these people in Oklahoma, and they told them, I said, okay, you're going to be able to go out and stake your land. All right. And what we're going to do is everybody's going to line up here, and we're all going to camp out for the night. And in the morning, they're going to fire off a cannon. So when you hear the boom, you go out in your covered wagons and your horses and shit, and you stake out the land you want. Well, in the middle of the night, a bunch of people went out and they scoped the land before everybody else, much sooner than everyone else. They scoped the land with it had a creek running through it and had water and, an access here and what have you. And so when that boom went off, there were people that were already out there sooner than everyone else that had already staked and stolen the good land.
Right.
So they were called Sooners. The people that waited for the boom were Boomers. That's where you get Boomer Sooner. I'm a cheater because I'm a Sooner.
I love you for that. Let my family save your family some cash. You don't need perfect credit. You don't need money out of your pocket, but we will save you money. It's not a matter if, it's a matter of how much. SaveWithConrad.com.
So that's where, again, their whole identity is based in cheating.
They're heels.
They're heels.
Yeah.
They're heels. Why would you like someone that would sneak off ahead of everyone, not play fair, stake out your land, and you're a cheater, and you're proud of it. Boom Sooner, I'm a cheater. I'm a Sooner, I'm a cheater. Deep-de-deep-doo. I never got it.
Well,
and the person that told me that and gave me that analogy was an Oklahoman. Who had his land stripped from him anyway.
Jim Ross is taking you off his Christmas card list, just so you know.
Yeah, I've been off of it for a while.
So Dr. Death is going to split his time between Jim Crockett / the NWA, whatever you want to call it, and All Japan Pro Wrestling. when does someone with the amateur background and the size of Dr. Death catch Vince's eye? Do you remember there ever being even preliminary discussions? Because there's a lot of talent leaving Jim Crockett and jumping ship over to the World Wrestling Federation, whether it's what's going to be the Big Boss Man or Rick Rude or Ron Garvin or the Brainbusters, on and on. Folks are jumping ship. Dr. Death, not so much. Why is that?
Because Doc had Japan, and Doc loved Japan.
I see.
So Doc had that deal in Japan, which made his year. So for him to come back and not have to work a full schedule with Jim Crockett, it's like, yeah, okay, I'll come back and work some dates here in the States and everything. But his deal, I mean, the bulk of his year was Japan.
Did you, we know most of Steve's success came from Japan, specifically working in All Japan. Before Jim Ross came on board with the WWF, I guess in 93, do you remember there ever even being a preliminary discussion? Because I could see how you would have that guy with a mouthpiece. Maybe Bobby Heenan is going to be his mouthpiece. He could have been an opponent for Hogan, right?
I think so. I think that Doc definitely could have. And I know there were attempts when DiBiase came in, and we looked at Doc and thought, hey, this may be somebody that could come in, but I don't know that Vince ever really saw a character in him. The Dr. Death moniker is one thing, but what is a Dr. Death? And at the same time, Doc had a look that was scary. I mean, you look at him, Doc was the real deal. And I think that we definitely could have done something with him for the same reason that Doc wasn't interested in working for Jim Crockett on a regular basis, was the same reason Doc wasn't interested in coming into WWE, because he had, more freedom by going to Japan and then come back and work the dates he wanted to work.
So we know JR is going to get hired in 93. Once JR comes in as an announcer, is he bringing up Dr. Death at all?
It's funny. JR talks about all the people he brought in. Does JR ever talk about how he came in?
Yeah, we've told the story about how.
Who'd he call?
Bruce Prichard.
Okay, I just want to make sure.
Move
sooner. We're a cheater. We went sooner. We didn't wait for the boom boom. Those boomers, they are losers.
Okay. Boy, this is going to end in a cage match, a salad steel cage match. Chat me up though. When Dr. Death comes in, or when JR comes in, does he start campaigning for his old pal, Steve Williams?
I do think that, JR mentioned Dr. Death because JR has always been a big advocate of Dr. Death, and rightfully so. I was a big advocate for Dr. Death. So here was somebody that had not really been tapped and not been put in a prominent position in the States since Mid-South and since Bill Watts. So to a lot of domestic viewers, Doc would be new no matter where he was in Crockett or WWE.
So Steve's beating up his body pretty badly in the 90s with All Japan, and his career comes to a full stop in 95 when he has a situation at Customs. Of course, marijuana is heavily frowned upon in Japan, and that's a big deal there. So there's a lot of folks, including Paul McCartney, who are now banned from entering the country because of it. But somehow Giant Baba uses his political stroke for Steve to only be quote unquote suspended for 1 year. Do you remember this marijuana story making headlines? And what can you tell us about Giant Baba's political power, if any, in Japan?
Well, working backwards, Baba was extremely powerful in Japan, and as was Inoki. Inoki was in the Senate, but Baba had connections as well. And being a former baseball player and the promoter of the #1 Japan office at the time, that had a lot of stroke, that had a lot of power. And thank God, because had Doc not worked for All Japan and Giant Baba for not being a celebrity, he could have landed underneath the jail in Japan, and we would have gone, hey, whatever happened to Steve Williams? So just to get out in general and then only to be suspended spoke an awful lot to the power of Mr. Baba.
Were you personally caught off guard with this news of Dr. Death and marijuana being such an issue over there? Were you nervous about it or how it could affect the WWF, or did everybody sort of know, hey guys, you know, what you're doing in Oklahoma or Florida or whatever is whatever, but you can't do it in Japan?
Well, most guys were smart enough not to do it in Japan. That's, again, there are places that you go, you don't take it into Canada. There are just certain things that you should be smart about and or smarter about, and taking drugs into a foreign country, I wouldn't recommend, folks. Yeah. Ever.
Chat me up about All Japan, or specifically ECW. You know, he even pops up while he's working a lot of these All Japan matches. And of course, tape trading is a big thing with the hardcore fans who read the Observer and whatnot. So they're hearing about these great matches and then they're trading tapes to see them. So of course, Paul Heyman brings him in for a couple of ECW shots, but in that era, it almost felt like ECW, for lack of a better word, was almost your own developmental. And so guys would sort of get their big sort of coming out party for that sort of hardcore audience with ECW. And then you guys would drink that milkshake up and bring them over. Is that ultimately what gets him noticed, or is it Johnny Ace or some other? How does this come to be where he initially has an opportunity with the WWF?
With Dr. Death?
Yes.
Well, Doc was always on the radar, and Doc was someone that, you know, kind of like Avatar, that JR would constantly bring up.
Yeah.
And I don't know that, that can be a detriment as much as anything else sometimes. So unfortunately for Doc, I think it was a bit of a detriment sometimes. However, man, Doc was just one of those guys that had it, and he had something special about him. And after the drug bust, if you want to call it that, in Japan, well, that doesn't shine favorably on someone wanting to come into the company, and you need to give that some time. That wouldn't have been a good look to bring Doc in at that time. However, for ECW, my God, he's a hero then. So of course they would use him, and thank God they did.
Let's talk about the Observer here for a minute. It's the February 16th, 1998 edition. Johnny Ace worked the WWF TV tapings in Indianapolis doing a tryout match, but they didn't come with any sort of counter proposal. From a WWF standpoint, they've put a lot of heat on Fumi Sato, the bilingual writer for Weekly Pro Wrestling, who was there to serve as both Giant Baba's interpreter and also for his knowledge of the American wrestling scene. At this point, they claim they don't want to do any negotiations if Sato is involved because they felt he was confrontational. The basic gist appears that Sato pointed out that the mainstream pro wrestling fans in Japan aren't all that familiar with the WWF wrestlers except for Vader and Ken Shamrock, who originally made their names in Japan. The only WWF television in Japan is on a satellite show that only is in 500,000 homes in the entire country. So you've got to figure at most 20,000 homes are reached each week. However, when WWF officials Gerald Briscoe and Bruce Prichard went to Japan and saw Steve Austin on the cover of several newspapers from the Tyson angle and saw wrestling magazines and where there were color photos of WWF major events, they saw things a different way. Some in the WWF felt that Baba himself went into the meeting with little to no knowledge of the WWF product or its stars, while from a Japanese standpoint, there was the same thought in regard to Briscoe and Prichard coming in with no understanding of All Japan, the Japanese wrestling business, and felt insulted by their lack of knowledge going in as to Misawa, Kawada, or Kenta Kobashi. Let's table it right now and just take a time out. What do you remember of this meeting? What was the original goal, and how did it get sideways with you guys in All Japan?
Oh, very simple. The original goal was to see if we could work together, and we had done business with other Japanese offices over there, much smaller Japanese offices over there that had paid a great deal of money to bring in WWE talent. And we wanted to, from a perception standpoint, work with one of the bigger offices. And we're looking to open up discussions with Baba since he wasn't working with an American company. New Japan was working with WCW, and we were looking to do something with All Japan where we could come in and allow them to utilize some of the WWE stars, and vice versa, that we would also take a look at some of the bigger Japanese stars as well to give them exposure in the States to benefit both companies. Fumi Saito was the translator in that meeting, and the word came back that basically no one knows anything about the WWE stars. No one knows who Undertaker is. No one knows who Steve Austin is. No one knows who The Rock is. No one knows who Shawn Michaels is. No one knows any of these talent that you're putting on here. And we were like,
huh?
Okay, because again, we did have all, the stuff that we had got over there just to see. We walked around the city just to see, what their own magazines, their own newspapers, all of their stuff that Fumi Saito was involved with. Well, the covers were all WWE guys.
Right.
Were all the guys that we were talking about.
Sure.
There weren't Japanese stars on any of those. These huge mega Japanese stars. No, the stars that were selling their magazines and their newspapers and things were WWE stars. So I'm like, you don't know any of these guys, but yet here they are in your newspaper, here they are on your magazines, and your competitors are paying us a great deal of money to bring them over for like one date. Maybe we're negotiating with the wrong people here. If you don't know them and you're not interested in them, I really don't know what we're doing here. Because we can go across the street and meet with 5 other companies and get 10 times the money.
Right.
And it just became it was a waste of time. It really was a waste of time. It was a nice trip. I love Japan. I enjoyed going over there. Didn't enjoy that experience. And then, let me tell you the next part of this story is this Fumi Saito.
Yep.
Sat there and told us how he doesn't know any of these WWE stars we're trying to sell, comes to our next event, which was a SummerSlam, I believe, in New Jersey, and comes running up, and he's backstage. I'm like, why in the hell is this guy backstage, and who are all these people? He comes back and says, oh, my God, this is the biggest travel club thing we have ever done. So what do you mean? And he goes, well, because I do these travel tours, where we go to WrestleMania, we go to SummerSlam, we go to Survivor Series and Rumble. And this is the biggest one we've ever done. This is incredible. This is so great. I said, well, why are they here?
Yeah.
He said, what do you mean? So well, they don't know any of these stars.
Oh God.
Why would they travel from Japan all the way over here?
Yeah.
For what? They don't know anybody. And so now it's like Steve Austin and Undertaker and a few other guys and The Rock have gotten wind that this guy's backstage and go over, and Undertaker walks up to him and goes, hello, how are you? My name is The Undertaker. I'm a very big star over here. I know you don't know who I am, but I've kicked, and he named all the Japanese guys whose asses he's kicked in the past. And of course, Rock couldn't resist, and Rock had to go over and introduce himself. And it's just, Austin just kind of walked right by. But we were treated in a way that of insignificance. And if Bob was insulted that Vince didn't come over, well, we were highly insulted that we came over and had to deal with a guy that didn't know our product or said he didn't know our product. And a lot of times you get people, and here's the other thing that was extremely insulting about it, was Jerry Briscoe had spent his entire career and had gone over to work for Mr. Baba many times in his career. His brother Jack made Baba NWA champion against the NWA's orders and had a great relationship with Mr. Baba. However, Mr. Baba chose not to speak English and not to communicate with us during this meeting in English at all. So that was insulting and not a good meeting in any way, shape, or form. During that time that we were there, we went out one night to go get some Korean barbecue, ran into Dr. Death and Steve Albright. on the street
over in Japan.
In Japan.
Wow.
And my good friend Johnny Ace, who is my good friend, was like working for Baba, and he about panicked, but trying to get us into a taxi cab to get us away from Dr. Death, who I had known since he broke into the business. And I didn't know Steve Albright at the time, or Gary Albright, Steve Albright, Steve Williams, Gary Albright. But they were like, get them out of here. And I'm like, we're not here to steal your talent. We're here to work together.
Right.
So it was a little insulting. Yeah.
Let's continue the write-up from the Observer, because I know you're going to have an issue with this. Baba apparently also felt that if he was negotiating at the table as company president, then Vince McMahon should have been there as well, since he's the one, not Prichard or Briscoe, who can finalize any deals. As mentioned before, the two sides were far apart on money. WWF appears right now to be under the impression that Baba wanted their top stars at the same price he had paid for top foreigners like Stan Hansen, Steve Williams, Gary Albright, and the top WWF talent is worth far more in value in the United States to them for a weekend in the US than what that figure would be. Of course, the WWF originally came in asking for a $1 million for a package deal, maybe 8 to 12 wrestlers, which was an offer Baba apparently felt was so out of line that he didn't even respond to it with a counter. There were also others trying to work as some sort of intermediaries or go-betweens to salvage at least getting The Undertaker, Vader, and Shamrock to work the Dome show. Do you remember the offer, not even being responded to? I mean, I understand
there was no offer.
Okay.
There was no offer because the lack of knowledge of our talent and the amount of money that we were receiving from other offices in Japan, whether they were third, fourth, or fifth tier offers, they were huge money deals.
Yeah.
So when we got into it and looking at, all right, what is that cost? What are you willing, to pay? Because here's what we have made for a talent here, a talent there, these different things. We're looking at not just doing one-offs with you. We're looking at possibly coming in and doing a week or doing a series of shows, and it never got to money. Because they said they didn't know who anybody was.
Yeah.
So how do you get to money if you don't know what you're buying?
Let's
So once again, believe it or not, that guy that wrote this is ill-informed or just made it up. Or maybe he was informed by Fumi Saito. Maybe Fumi didn't fully understand English or what have you, one side or the other.
Fumi and Dave are friends. They do podcasts together.
The figures.
So chat me up though.
Maybe that's why Fumi didn't know who anybody was.
Let me ask about the sort of insinuation that Baba was upset that McMahon wasn't there. Did you know that until I read that?
No. And again, Jerry and I were the ones that were making the international deals.
Yeah. Well, listen, I know it feels like a sidebar, all this All Japan discussion, but not too terribly long after all of this, all of a sudden, Dr. Death shows up in the WWF, and it doesn't seem like there's a ton of notice with him finishing up in All Japan. Do you remember how he comes over, and was there some sort of hurt feelings or burned bridge on the other end?
With Japan?
Yeah.
I have no idea. Steve had come in. Steve met with JR and I one night late in the office, brought him up, and we made a deal. And man, I've loved Steve. I consider Steve a friend and a hell of a talent. I thought that he was somebody that was underutilized everywhere he had been. And in coming in, we've been after him for years, but I also understood his loyalty to Japan and his desire to work less of a schedule by going to Japan a few times a year. And so it just never worked. And at this time it happened to work. And I was very happy for that. So it was, Jim and I were definitely on the same page as far as getting him into the company.
Let's talk about JR for a moment, because JR wrote in his book, Under the Black Hat, that it wasn't just him who's keen on Dr. Death coming in, but you are. Do you remember saying, okay, perhaps things didn't work out with All Japan. Why not just get what we want? We want Dr. Death. Let's bring him over.
It had nothing to do with Japan at all. Like nothing to do with Japan. It was all about Steve.
What was your vision for Steve?
Well, I think I would have loved to have been able to bring Steve in as a nasty heel to work with Stone Cold Steve Austin. I think Doc, was one of those guys that would be able to go and be a formidable opponent for old Stone Cold and get more than one match out of him. And that was the idea. That was the idea very much of everybody you brought in. Who can we feed to Stone Cold? And Doc would have been a fresh opponent.
How about this for a debut? Vince McMahon introduces him to the crowd on April 28th, 1998 in Richmond, Virginia, but it's not on TV. And then he goes out and beats Too Cold Scorpio with a backdrop driver. Was there discussions about, hey, we need to give this guy the vignette treatment or not? I've always been fascinated with, here's how we introduce Val Venus. Here's how we introduce Razor Ramon. Here's how we introduce Dusty, whatever. And then there's other guys where, nope, they're here. What was the thinking in terms of the presentation to bring him in and establish him to this American audience?
Well, this was during a Russo time, and I think that, there were different ideas banning about. I believe that Dr. Death coming in and doing vignettes with him probably would have helped him some. But that didn't happen.
What does that mean?
Well, I'm sure we're going to get there.
Okay. So Williams heads back to Japan to finish up. Is there any concern when you've got a guy working a style like that, hey, we're bringing him in, but now we're letting him finish up? What if he fucks around and gets hurt?
That's always a concern, whenever anybody is finishing up anywhere or works anywhere that is not standardized rings and under our supervision. So that's always a concern.
Did you have any involvement with the negotiation end of bringing Steve in?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? I'm not asking you to give us specifics, but what was important to him or whatever?
Yeah. What was important to Steve was money, and Steve was looking for a steady gig. Steve was looking for something that he knew was going to be there and come in and make a difference and possibly make some huge money, and the opportunity to come in and have the possibility of working with the biggest name in the business and in Austin at the time was very attractive.
Is it part of your recollection that Dr. Death was asked to drop some weight before being put on TV? I think that narrative is out there that you guys wanted him to step his game up aesthetically. Do you recall that being an issue?
No, not to my knowledge. I know that Doc came in and Doc worked the camps and came in and worked a couple of weeks in the ring with Tom to basically get the ring rust off because he hadn't been working for a while. And so he came in to do that. But I don't remember Steve ever being heavy other than when he first broke in.
The Observer says there's serious consideration being given to using Vince McMahon as sort of a manager, although not using that term, for Steven Regal and Steve Williams, as if he's bringing two shooters in to beat Austin for the title and give guys instant steam. And I got to tell you, we've all heard, Dr. Death's coming in for a program with Steve Austin. We've all heard that, but this idea that Vince McMahon was going to quote unquote manage them. Now that's news to me. Do you remember this ever being discussed?
No.
Okay. We've all covered this before in the archives. Brawl For All is where Dr. Death really makes his World Wrestling Federation television debut. And the rumor and innuendo was that this was a vehicle to get him over as this big bad heel for a run with Steve Austin. Do you want to poke holes in that narrative?
Sure. I think that, first of all, for Steve to come in, I think Steve should have been brought in a completely different way. Unfortunately, as I said, sometimes how you push someone and what you say to put a talent over to bring them in or to get somebody to want to use them will somewhat backfire on you if you're not careful. And in this case, it was, he's the baddest man on the planet and nobody can beat him. And, if it were a shoot, by God, he'd walk through that wall. You want to see him walk through that wall? Just tell him, walk through that wall. And he'll be on the other side. No question. He'll just do it. Motherfuckers, he'd kill you in 8 seconds. Only because he wants to have fun for 5. That kind of buildup became, again, the catalyst for this stupid Brawl For All idea. And then it became, okay, well, you want to get somebody over? They win this. And if this guy can kill everybody, beat everybody, he shouldn't have any problem being in it, but he needs to know that it'll be real and the other guys in there. This isn't to put him over, but if he gets over in it, then great. And some people thought that he would just steamroll through everyone.
Some people thought, meaning Jim Ross.
Well, that's fresh there, Connie. I'm just saying, if there's a goddamn law you want him to go through, you go through the goddamn thing.
Did it ever get so far as to talking to Steve about working with Dr. Death? About Austin?
Steve Austin?
Yeah.
I think Steve Austin was fucking thrilled to be able to have a Dr. Death to work with. I don't know that there was ever any aversion to it at all.
It is just sort of interesting that, sometimes, and maybe I'm just thinking of Jeff Jarrett and his new podcast, My World. It feels like Austin was only at the time working with established top guys, not necessarily somebody who's fresh off, a Japan run, right?
Just because we didn't have anybody like a Dr. Death that was able to come in and do that.
Fair to say. Well, you know what's coming next. July 14th, Dr. Death debuts in the first round for the Brawl For All, and he destroys Pierre, who was, of course, just working with one eye. And then we see Dr. Death actually have a big night in the ratings, believe it or not. So Dr. Death versus Pierre, aka the Pirate, as we call him, PCO these days in Ring of Honor, beat Sting and Nash against Giant and Scott Hall head to head in the ratings battle. Internally, are people giving any credit for that to Dr. Death, or just is it mostly the Brawl For All concept?
I think it's a curiosity factor of the Brawl For All concept more than anything as to what the hell is this going to be.
I think that's fair.
And Pierre.
So, Bart Gunn's scheduled to face Dan Severn, and it's expected
to catch a ball.
It's a miracle. Bart Gunn is scheduled to face Dan Severn, and it's expected that Dan would win and we would get a rematch of the 81 NCAA tournament where Williams beat Severn, but the brackets are redone and Severn pulls out after beating the Godfather, noting he has nothing to prove. At this point, this whole Brawl For All thing is a giant clusterfuck. Fair to say?
At this point?
Yeah. I mean, like whatever initial idea we had, we know this is not going to end well.
It was a clusterfuck to begin with.
So we know the story here. Bart Gunn knocks out Dr. Death in the third round. Williams winds up dislocating his knee during a takedown, which made him a sitting duck. And then when he gets knocked out, he tears his hamstring. You can just literally watch your investment in Dr. Death disappear in front of your eyes. What do you remember about Dr. Death's reaction that night? JR's reaction? What was Vince thinking? Just take us back to that night.
Well, first of all, I'll take you back to the week before. It was Bart Gunn calling me and asked me if he was going to get fired if he knocked Dr. Death out.
Right.
So why would you get fired? So, well, I know you guys want him to win this. I said, look, man. So they wanted to be a shoot. Knock him out. Knock him out. At this point, we're doing it. So to me, that would be great TV. And, everybody was like, great, knock him out. Who the fuck cares? Just do it, and it'll be great TV.
Yeah.
And Bart did. Bart knocked him out. But I think that JR is kind of like, Don King watching Mike Tyson get knocked out.
Yeah.
Like, oh my God. I heard a golden goose.
What was Dr. Death's reaction afterwards?
Oh man, see, here's the thing that if Doc had been an asshole and been going around talking about how tough he was and he could beat everybody up, that would be one thing.
Right.
You never heard that out of Doc.
Yeah.
Doc didn't have to tell people how tough he was.
He just was.
Doc was tough.
Yeah.
Doc was a bad motherfucker, and people knew it, but he didn't have to tell people that.
Yeah.
So you liked, I don't know anybody that didn't like Steve Williams. So you felt bad for him. I felt horrible for him because he was hurt. Not that he lost a fucking match or a fight. Not, the fact that he got hurt.
Yeah.
To the extent that he got hurt. I mean, it ripped his fucking hamstring off.
Yeah.
And he was fucking dejected, man. He I don't know, his first fight he ever lost or not. I don't know. But I think that Doc felt the pressure of, you gotta go out there and beat Dr. Death. And, you. And you can hear you go back and listen to that and watch that. You can hear the disappointment in JR's voice calling that.
Yeah.
You really can. But he had been built up, and then all of a sudden he was a shell of what he was as a young man. Still walking in there? Fuck. Steve Williams, Dr. Death, was a tough son of a bitch.
Yeah.
Should he have been in the ring with a much younger Bart Gunn, who is a tough son of a bitch? Neither one of them should have been in the ring doing that shit.
Right. Bad
concept, bad idea, bad execution, and unfortunately, a lot of people got injured because of it. And one of the casualties, big casualty of the Brawl For All experiment was what could have been a great run with Dr. Death, Steve Williams, ended right there.
So obviously plans change. He's off TV and he's recovering. You sort of said you thought that was maybe the end. Do you think when a guy like, let's compare it to real boxing or saying real, obviously the Brawl For All was real, but you know what I mean? In the UFC, sometimes when a guy is undefeated and he loses, people are quick to say, oh, his drawing ability's dead. But that's proven to not be the case. Conor McGregor sold more pay-per-views after a loss. So did Chuck Liddell, et cetera, et cetera. It's when fans lose complete confidence. I mean, the reality is I think fans understand no one is unbeatable, but this is a different era of professional wrestling. Wins and losses matter more. And this has certainly been positioned as, now this isn't wink and a nod, ha ha, this is real. Do you think in the mind of Vince McMahon at this point, any plans of Dr. Death being a top guy are dead just because of the way he got knocked out?
The aura was gone. The mystery was gone.
Yeah. So let's keep it going here. We know what's next. He's going to be rehabbed and he is going to come back. Before we talk about that, while he's down and out in training, I'm sure Jim Ross is keeping in touch with him. Are you in touch with Dr. Death at all while he's off TV?
Oh yeah. Just, again, you're trying to keep his spirits up and get him back as soon as possible. So we both were. And again, Steve's a good fucking dude.
Yeah.
So you're just kind of checking on him.
So what were you thinking creatively? It makes the Observer here that, we're talking early 99 here. Quote, Steve Williams is ready to go. They're going to reintroduce him as a character who's turned his back on America for Japan and do vignettes before him starting on TV. Who came up with this idea? And is that why he was wearing this kabuki mask when he returned?
I think it was a combination of a lot of things, frankly. His love of Japan, one, but to present him in a different way and get away from the Dr. Death stuff, because I think that the Dr. Death kick-ass guy, it's kind of tough to get back to that after losing the way that he did to Bart, which was unfortunate. And the idea, horrible idea, and I think it was Vince McMahon's idea to to do something, and he was like going, "God damn it, Bruce, you're the only one that can do this," and wanted me to basically be the manager for Dr. Death in a kabuki outfit and paint my face and do my hair black and cut half Japanese and half American in broken English promos. Yeah, I didn't say it was a good idea.
That's it's out of the book of bad ideas for sure.
Yeah, it just, it was one of those things of he needed a mouthpiece, wasn't a great promo, and in order to tell this story of America turning their back on him and him turning his back on America, you needed someone else to tell that story.
Is it a little, considering the whole Canada USA thing that Bret Hart and the Hart Foundation really set the business on fire with 2 years prior? Is this a little too carbon copy? But boy, there's definitely some quality loss when you go from the original to a first generation or whatever.
Well, the idea was to spin a story that Dr. Death couldn't get booked in the United States because he was too dangerous, and that, his country, they'd turn their back on him. He couldn't even get work here because he was too dangerous. However, the Japanese embraced him, so he's embracing Japan and using everything that he learned over there to become even more dangerous and become more of a force. It really wasn't a USA versus Japan deal. It was no one in the States would touch me because I was too dangerous. Right. Japan embraced me.
Right. Let's talk about when he actually gets back in the ring. He beats Bob Holly in a dark match, but apparently even though he gets the win, you guys see something you don't like, because he's sent to the WWF training camp to get quote unquote back into ring shape. And while he's at camp, he's going to have matches with Midian and Pierre, and Dr. Tom, I assume, is running these camps and giving you guys reports. Let's talk about that for a minute. What did you see when he came back from injury in this match with Holly that made you think, he ain't ready, he needs to go to camp? Is it just ring rust, or was he heavy, or what do you recall?
I think it was a confidence thing. I think it was that he had a lot of ring rust and maybe had lost some of his confidence. So they just wanted, get him back in the ring.
Power Pro Wrestling from Memphis would announce this match: Randy Hales, Baldo, Sean Stasiak, and Vic Grimes against Dr. Death, Steve Williams, Giant Silva, Tom Prichard, and what the hell is this? Bruce Prichard.
Main event anywhere on Beale Street.
Bruce Prichard in a wrestling match, standing across from Randy Hales, Baldo, Sean Stasiak, and Vic Grimes. What do you remember about this?
I remember going over, motherfucker.
You did.
I did. Big baby face. This you can point to this. This would be the one and only time in my entire career that I ever did anything as a baby face.
Well, one-time baby face, and with your brother, no less.
Yeah. It was fucking God. It was terrible.
What's the thinking here?
I don't know. I didn't book it.
God, we're trying to do a podcast, Bruce. Help me out.
Fucking Randy Hales thought it'd be great. I know. Like, what the fuck am I going to do, Randy? Well, you'll work with me. So what the fuck are you going to do, Randy?
You're a 3-time karate black belt Hall of Famer at that point.
Now I'm a 4-time black belt Hall of Famer, motherfucker.
But back then you were probably just 3, right?
98? 2 or 3, yeah.
Yeah.
At least 2.
So let's talk about Dr. Death. When he comes back to the WWF, he knocks Bart Gunn off the stage through a table, and he's wearing this kabuki mask.
Kabuki!
Hypothetically, you're sitting next to Vince McMahon, you're in Gorilla, he sees it. What's his reaction to seeing this?
Vince was probably doing goddamn commentary. I don't know. Fuck.
Does he have a strong reaction to the kabuki presentation? That's where I'm trying
kabuki. To get. Are you there, boy? Are you a warrior?
Assassin is the word.
Assassin. I'm getting there.
Yeah.
I was assassinate. Anyway. Okay. Stunk. It stunk. I mean, what else are you gonna say? This is drizzly shits. It's Doc in a fucking kabuki mask.
Well, it lasts a whole week, and then the next week, Jim Ross returns and calls out Bart Gunn and blames him for his Bell's palsy attack, and slaps him before Williams comes out and German suplexes him and hits a backdrop driver. And Meltzer would call it one of the most distasteful segments since the Melanie Pillman interview. What'd you think of this? The idea being that we're going to make JR an evil manager of sorts, and we're going to have him blame other people on his Bell's palsy attack. Yeah, not great.
Well, I mean, two of those three aren't hard to do. I mean, they're based in reality, but I hated it. I just hated it. I look, man, JR's friend, and it was, yes, JR could be miserable, and JR could cut promos on everybody and do all that shit and all this other stuff. But I just didn't feel that the audience would feel the same way. And that Doc, I didn't like the presentation. I just didn't like the presentation. Didn't like it. Nothing about it that I liked. Any way, shape, or form.
Well, we know what's coming.
You can tell from there.
JR is the evil heel, and it's going to go downhill in a hurry. What did JR think about this? You know, the idea that he has to, because we know, if nothing else, I know JR loved being talent relations and he loved being quote unquote office, but he really loved being the voice of wrestling. He loved doing commentary. Is he hesitant to want to do an on-screen character thing and really just prefers to be behind the desk? What do you remember of that?
I think JR doesn't like to be disliked.
Yeah.
I think that Jim is one of those people that I don't think Jim is a convincing heel because he doesn't like it. You know, some of us really enjoy pissing people off and being booed and hated and playing a heel character. Jim did not enjoy playing a heel character. He may have been one in real life, but he didn't enjoy playing it on screen.
At this point, are you having any serious conversations with Dr. Death? I mean, just sort of take me through. Are you the one who lays out the kabuki mask creative and then meets with him to talk about the Jim Ross is going to be your manager? What's his demeanor? I mean, is he vocally unhappy, or is he just, hey man, I'm here to do what y'all want and get paid and make the town?
Doc was there to do whatever we wanted to do. And I believe I did talk to him about the kabuki stuff and the whole Japanese scenario as far as, you know, being too dangerous and all that other good shit. You know, I did lay all of that out for him. I didn't do the Jim Ross one, no, because that didn't come from me. And I just thought it would be short-lived, and not something anybody wanted to embrace, including but especially the audience.
Let's talk about the next piece of creative here for JR. On the following week on Monday Night Raw, JR calls out Michael Cole and pulls out the red gi and mask that Dr. Death had been wearing and said, this is what the quote unquote WWF creative team had planned for one of the greatest athletes in the world. He kicks Cole low and tries to take over commentary before Vince sends Terry Taylor down and Steve Williams convinces Ross to leave. JR's delivery here is great, but this is just not good in hindsight, right?
However, the stuff when JR had his own little announce table next to the Raw, that was some of the most entertaining shit ever on Raw. And that part was damn entertaining.
It winds up with Ross and Williams on Raw having a new commentary table built. And as you mentioned, JR still doing his own commentary, but Dr. Death winds up beating not one, but both of the Hardy Boys on a Sunday Night Heat taping. And it's kind of crazy to think about. You know, by no mercy, the Hardy Boys are big stars, and that probably wouldn't happen again. But then comes the debut of Ed Ferrara as a parody of Jim Ross when Tiger Ali Singh offered him $500 to do a JR impression, and that gets him dumped on his head by Dr. Death. And of course, Tiger gets beat up pretty well by Dr. Death as well. What'd you think of the Ed Ferrara parody back then?
I hated it. And then Ed fancied himself as a worker. And, yeah, I can take it. And then didn't take the suplex well. But, yeah, I'm not a fan.
I get that. It's hard to really like. Yeah. Did JR ever express any concerns about the way he was being positioned here?
I don't think JR liked it at all. You know, and I think JR kind of felt from the Dr. Death point of view that we were missing the boat on a big nasty heel that could have been. Unfortunately, that big nasty heel had been knocked out by a guy in the middle of the card that no one had a lot of confidence in. And that, you know, that was just reality at the time. You know, Bart was, and I wish, you know, you further that by, okay, fuck, now Bart could be star. You put him in the ring with a real boxer and now you fuck that up.
Yeah.
There's a lot. Yeah. There were a lot of lessons that you learned throughout this whole thing. And they're hard lessons that regardless of whether you got the Midas touch or not, sometimes it doesn't all turn to gold.
Well, and I know JR couldn't have been tickled with the creative of Ed sort of mocking him, but JR winds up calling the main event of WrestleMania that year, probably because of Steve Austin. What do you remember about that? I mean, he's not doing regular commentary. He's got this heel character position, but when it comes to the main event of WrestleMania, he's back behind the desk calling it.
Well, I think it was something that Stone Cold wanted and felt that this was the best way. Kind of, let's just do this, ignore the rest of the shit and move on.
The next night on Raw, Jim Ross isn't announcing, and Steve Williams is taking on Bob Holly for the hardcore title. And JR is back and trying to do English commentary, but he's at the Spanish announce table. And then Al Snow hits Dr. Death with a frying pan after Williams hits Holly with the Oklahoma Stampede. And somehow Bob Holly retains. And the next night Raw is taped for the following week, and Steve Williams attacks Al Snow and Bob Holly after their match. And Steve also works with Tiger Ali Singh in a dark match and picks up the win. And then out of nowhere, Steve Williams is released. Meltzer would write, the biggest shock of the list was Williams, who was never really given a chance. Williams, 38, was the top foreign star for All Japan when he was lured away last year with the idea of being an opponent on top for his namesake, Steve Austin. Steve Williams was going to be marketed without a gimmick other than his toughness. The Brawl For All concept was put in place as a shoot, largely as a way for him to get over as a legitimately tough guy and threat for Austin. In hindsight, the idea was a huge miscalculation, since Williams was a very good amateur wrestler and being the only pro wrestler in history to ever be a 4-time NCAA placement winner. But he was never a boxer, and Brawl For All entailed a lot of boxing. He goes on from there, just sort of laying out exactly how this thing got sideways. But the idea is, even now, after that injury, he's still not 100%. And he had that lame Japanese mask gimmick, and they probably had some poor creative and being the protege of Jim Ross and all of that. But now that Jim Ross is back at the broadcast booth, Meltzer would write, quote, it left Williams with no spot. Word has it that Vince McMahon was fairly insistent on Williams having no future with the company, since the WWF is so heavily based on looks and acting ability. While Williams is probably still one of the strongest men in the company, he doesn't have a pretty physique, and he is a notoriously poor talker. Plus, his in-ring style is quite a bit tougher from the Japan background than the company's used to, and it's not flashy by American standards. So a lot to unpack here, but it came down to, as you heard from the very beginning of the recap from the Observer, the biggest shock on the list. For years and years, it's become, I guess, a changing of the guard of sorts after WrestleMania, and Dr. Death finds himself lumped in here. Do you recall, Vince McMahon's opinion? I mean, the word here is Vince was fairly insistent on Williams having no future with the company. Can you agree, disagree? How does this come to be?
Well, I think that it was more of a cost-cutting thing, and I wasn't involved. So I just think it was cost-cutting and looking at the upside. And I don't think there was a whole lot of upside at that point.
Unfortunately, JR is the guy who has to make the call, and it doesn't go well. It's going to draw a wedge between their relationship. Why was the creative change so quickly? Is it because Jim Ross wanted to do commentary again and you realize, well, that idea won't work now either?
Well, yeah, because you've got, look, Jim wasn't happy doing it. Doc wasn't happy doing it, I don't think, even though I think Doc would have done anything we asked him to do. So it becomes a battle, and at that point, you just kind of got to cut bait and move on.
Here's something that, I don't think we've discussed at all. Did the company feel like Dr. Death was just too beat up at this point to handle the WWF schedule? I only asked because in my research, I don't think he ever worked a house show. He had dark matches and he had matches at the training camp, but I think he only worked 3 dark matches, 2 matches at the camp, 2 Brawl For All matches, and 2 TV matches. So it's one of the biggest signings that the WWF had in that year where people were really excited about, hey, what is this going to be? And it amounts to almost nothing. It feels like
I do think Doc worked more house shows, live events than that. Because we had him out there just trying to get his legs under him for a little while and maybe not advertise, but yeah, I'm sure he worked more than that, but at the same time, he never got out of the gate.
Right.
And so to do anything beyond that in any significant role was almost impossible.
It's so crazy to think about how brief his real run is. And we're still talking about it to this day. Do you think in hindsight, he's one of the great sort of what ifs of the WWF?
Yes, I do. I think that had Steve Williams come in under a different presentation, that, yeah, he definitely could have had a hell of a run.
It's fascinating to dig into this. He said in his autobiography and interviews afterwards that, his release was his refusal to go to FMW as requested by the WWF because he had a long-standing relationship with All Japan. So let me just catch everybody up. FMW is sort of the ECW of Japan. There's All Japan, there's New Japan. Maybe you could say that's WWF and WCW. Some people are chuckling at that. But then there is an FMW, which is sort of the more hardcore ECW-esque presentation. But you guys had a pretty good working relationship at this point with FMW, and you were even having Vader and Shamrock do stuff over there occasionally. Do you remember this discussion of, hey, we need you to go do FMW, and him just flat refusing to go?
I don't. I really don't. We did have a good relationship with FMW through Victor Quinones. Had a good relationship with Victor. I don't want to say we had this great relationship with Onita. It just was business and happenstance more than anything. But I really don't remember if that was the case or not. It may have been, but I don't remember because I could see that happening, saying, hey, there are people that want him. Maybe we can book him out.
So you believe, and I've always been led to believe that the release is your idea. It's not his idea. And it almost feels like sometimes it was inferred, well, I didn't do the FMW thing. And it feels open-ended, but clearly it's a release that neither he or Jim Ross is happy about.
I would believe so. Yeah.
So after he's released, while he's still got this hamstring issue, you guys give him permission, I assume, to work the Giant Baba Memorial Show. I say after he's released because he's still technically under contract. You guys wouldn't have had a problem with him working a memorial show. Y'all let that happen all the time, right?
Yeah, it wouldn't have been a problem.
So he goes on a radio show in November of 99 and claims that Triple H and Steve Austin, their angle with Jim Ross in October, was originally scheduled to be the same angle as to how he was going to start his feud with Steve Austin. Is that just wrestler talk, or do you remember that being originally discussed?
I don't ever remember that being discussed.
He also said in another radio interview that the goal was for him to begin his push when SmackDown launched on UPN. Did you ever hear that, or is this rumor and innuendo?
That would be rumor and innuendo.
Of course, we know he winds up coming back to the American television set when he makes controversial appearances on Nitro. He's managed by Ed Ferrara, the same guy who mocked JR and got dumped on his head as a result on Raw. This time he's portraying Jim Ross as Oklahoma. And unfortunately, Dr. Death winds up feuding with Vampiro, kind of, and he even winds up wrestling Jerry Only from the Misfits in a steel cage match. Buddy, this went from bad to worse here for Dr. Death, did it not?
Yeah, I thought it was horrible.
Do you think some of that was just Russo and Ed having fun with Jim Ross more so than doing anything with Dr. Death?
I probably so, but you'd have to ask them.
He's only in WCW for a couple of months before he heads back to All Japan Pro Wrestling. At this point, it feels like it's just obvious that the American wrestling audience is not going to get to see the Dr. Death that we hoped.
Yeah, I think that it was just it's a different style and a different presentation. And I don't know that Doc was someone that could fit into that style and presentation at the time.
So check this out. This is a part of the story you and I have never talked about. Dr. Death does a loop in 2003 in Louisiana with the WWE. He worked 2 matches with Lance Storm. And the Observer would say there had been talk of signing Steve Williams, but it's not decided one way or the other. One theory is because he comes from the All Japan system that he'll be able to work with younger wrestlers on doing slower paced and more mat oriented matches and doing matches where the holds mean something and the mat wrestling is worked as a struggle as opposed to simply resting in between high spots. Overall reports on Williams from the house shows over the weekend were not that strong. So in this little loop, Williams and Storm trade wins. What can you tell us about this? He gets another shot at the cup and it just doesn't work out.
Yeah. Let's take a look, see what kind of shape he's in and how he looks in the ring, and just take a look-see on the road.
Jim Ross went on to a radio show not long after that tour and said that Dr. Death wouldn't be brought in because he wouldn't have enough work to make a living. Is that how you remember it?
I just don't think that anybody was all that impressed.
So we know Dr. Death goes on to do an MMA show in Japan, and unfortunately he once again gets knocked out, this time in about 20 seconds. And it's announced just a few days later that he's in Houston and he's going to have to get surgery to remove cancerous polyps in his throat. When you find out that Dr. Death is in a real battle with cancer, do you reach out to him during this time? Did you know he was in Houston?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I did. I reached out. It was weird because I had to go through, I think, his brother in Denver to find him. And actually saw him at the hospital one day. So it was, yes, I did. And we talked. It was a rough go for him.
Believe it or not, that actually made the Observer. It would be written here. Steve Williams, when it came time for his surgery for throat cancer on April 6th, was told they would have to remove his voice box to get it all. Williams sought a second opinion, and the second doctor recommended he undergo chemotherapy and radiation treatment and see what happens. Williams is under the care in Houston at the famous MD Anderson Hospital, which is considered the best in the world. It's the same hospital that Bruce Prichard's wife has been using for years in her battle with cancer, which in her case is in remission. I know we don't normally talk about that, but since it was in the Observer, it's sort of out there. But you had to have some sort of, I don't know, heart to heart, or, I mean, you guys, for obvious reasons, he's probably not your favorite person and you're probably not his favorite person or whatever, because it didn't work out. No. But now you find yourself not in a work atmosphere, but in a, hey man, there's more to life than wrestling.
Yeah. I don't think Steve and I were ever in a situation where neither one of us were either favorite person. I think that we both, look, I always got along with Steve, even in his leaving. I think Steve and I always remained on good terms, and I never was on bad terms, at least to my knowledge, with Steve. And when I got a hold of him, was very receptive. And, it's unfortunately, it's a club that I belong to in that regard of having a loved one, deal with some tough stuff. And I looked at Doc as a loved one as well, and just tried to say, hey man, there's, you got to fight, and there can be hope. There really is, but you got to fight.
We're home stretching it now. He goes through various treatments and surgeries. He pulls through. He wrestles an indie show in August of 2005. He had only been declared cancer free in December of 2004. So it's a miracle that he's there. And you guys are looking out for him. He does some guest referee spots in March of 2006 on live events for the SmackDown brand. And he even is signed and reports to Ohio Valley to become a trainer in the developmental system. He's put on OVW TV to sort of give the rub to Jake Hager, who we know as Jack Swagger, but eventually is let go from OVW. Do you know why it didn't work out for him as a trainer?
I don't. I have no idea. I forgot he was even there.
In September of 2008, he announces his retirement from the ring. And in the worst news, the 5-year anniversary of his checkup from cancer, they find it has returned and it's worse. Sadly, he passed away on December 29th, 2009 at his home in Lakewood, Colorado. Man, knowing that this is a guy who was there sort of in your early beginnings in Texas, and you tried the big thing 15 years later and it doesn't work out. And then you run into each other in a real life situation and it comes to a sad and tragic end like this. What'd you think when you got the news that you lost your friend, Dr. Death?
Yeah, it was horrible. I mean, it really was. And I had seen him at like a convention or some kind of deal, man, but I'll never forget it because he was in the hallway. He was bald and had the voice box, and I didn't recognize him at that point. I as I got closer, I recognized the smile and I was like, oh my God, Steve. And, he knew, but that doesn't make it easy, just cause and I loved the man, and he was a friend and a hell of a talent, and is sorely missed. And he's a great guy, and gone way, way, way too soon. Just very, very sad. And I know your next question is my favorite memory of Doc, and my favorite memory of Doc was outside of Cooter's nightclub in Houston, Texas, off of Edgebrook, and Doc standing there after a wonderful evening of a few adult beverages, challenging a Ford Bronco to run him over. And the Ford Bronco was scared to death. And Ted DiBiase and I got him out of there, but that for some reason it always makes me laugh because Doc was standing there, come on! There was this old cowboy in his Ford Bronco, and that he was terrified, and Doc wasn't moving, and guess what? The Bronco backed up and left.
Doc went in the WWE Hall of Fame in this most recent class. We'll call it 2020 and 2021. What do you think his legacy will be in the business? Japan?
I think that when you go back, and I think Japan and Mid-South, because Doc was one of those names that emerged from that and came from a relatively rough beginning in the business to being one of the true superstars.
One last question, then we're going to wrap this one up, Bruce. Kurt Zamora wants to know, JR's name is constantly attached to Dr. Death, especially in the Attitude Era run. If he's not quote unquote JR's boy, does he get that chance and spot? So I guess two things here. One, what hurt Steve the most? The disaster at the Brawl For All, that JR was campaigning for him so much, or just bad creative?
Well, the Brawl For All hurt him the most. It was a combination of all things, but Jim didn't do it out of anything other than love and a great deal of respect for Dr. Death. And, I think people would skew that and spin that any way that they want to. But I know Jim really loved Doc and had a great deal of admiration for him, as I do. And, sometimes that can be read the wrong way, and we have fun with it, but it was just bad timing for Doc. It really was.
Well, may he rest in peace. His legacy is not forgotten. Throw in your Google machine, watch some old Dr. Death stuff from Japan or Mid-South. You'll be glad you did. And be sure to tune in next week. We're going to be back for Kevin Nash Part 2. I can't wait, Bruce. It's going to be fun.
Yeehaw. Saw him recently. Handsome as ever.
Until next time, he is at Bruce Prichard. I am at Hey, it's Conrad, and we are out of time. We'll see you soon
Rock
right
on.
Here on Something to Wrestle with Bruce Prichard.
I did the rock on too early.
That's okay.
Rock on.
You've been premature for years. Wait, is that rumor and innuendo? We'll see you next week. Hey, it's Conrad Thompson. Thanks for checking out the podcast here on YouTube. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notifications bell so you get a notice anytime we upload some new content. And go save yourself some money right now. If you're in a 30-year loan or you have credit card debt, it's not a matter of if I can save you money. It's a matter of how much. Find out right now for free at SaveWithConrad.com.